Hey, hello guys, and welcome back to my YouTube show. And today, in our 11th lecture, I am going to talk about the war's corruption in Soviet history, which took place from the late 1970s all the way until late 1980s, when the war in Afghanistan was coming to an end, and when the communist governments in Eastern Europe started to collapse or start to fall because of the capitalism began to take over there. So, Soviet corruption. Soviet corruption took place. The biggest Soviet corruption took place in December of 19. It was between 1977 or 1979, because those are two different dates. One is when Brezhnev was leader. That was when this corruption in U.S.S.R. took place. That was happened in December of 1979. So shortly after shortly after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. And that started a big corruption there because the oil prices decreased in Soviet Union because the Russia or the Soviet Union, which we called back then, invaded the Afghanistan because they were afraid that the Islam was going to spread to Afghanistan and then go into the Western Soviet republics because of the Iranian Revolution that happened in 1979. That was. And so that's why they invaded Afghanistan, and that started the huge corruption in the country. And there was the oil prices decreased, and there was nothing on the shelves, which was kind of horrible during that time in the from late 1970s all the way until the late 19 all the way to late 1980s when Gorbachev became leader and he determined to fix the Soviet economy and then bring Soviet Union to an end when he was leader of U.S.S.R. from 1985 to 1991. So during the corruption, it was kind of terrible because there was no food on the shelves, like in the stores or anything like that. So that was really terrible what was going on that time, and so people were very upset at the government. And so government promised them that they would give them, and then government promised them, no, government, the people in Soviet Union were very upset at the Soviet government because they refused, because there was no stuff on the shelves, the grocery stores, there was no food or any other, like bread or anything like that. So that was very horrible at that time. And so that was very terrible living in that condition during that corruption that was going on there. And so government promised the Soviet people that they would get food, they would get water during the corruption, and then it was a lie. That their government was basically brainwashing all these people, and so people were just very upset at the government because it was basically they were just lying. They didn't tell them like anything, tell them like it's true, it's going to happen or anything like that. It was just all lies, and so people were very upset at the government, the Soviet government, until like that was late 70s all the way until late 1980s when Gorbachev came. And so it was by 1981 to 1982. That was when Comrade Brezhnev was sick at the time, and then a bunch of other government officials began taking over for him. And there was another case in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan in the Western Soviet republics. That was Kazakhstan. I think that was Kazakhstan. There was a cotton case that was going on in Kazakhstan because the Soviet factories were not producing enough cotton, and so the Soviet workers started to try to, well, at least tried to produce enough cotton on the fields so there would be enough cotton on the field so the people could get, uh, so they could grow more. Basically, that was their plan, and so that was kind of very horrible. I mean, that was very bad. That was a corruption case going on there, and so no, that was kind of like horrible time. And then after Brezhnev died, it was in November 1982. The corruption was still going on, and so like a lot of people were not going to work because of it. Under his rule, there was no law stating that if you go to work, you will be arrested. That didn't happen under the Brezhnev rule because Brezhnev rule they didn't have that rule. But when after the new general secretary was elected, Yuri Andropov became power as the general secretary of Communist Party of the U.S.S.R. And he was he was the first ever chairman of the KGB to become leader of the Soviet Union. No one else held that position as general secretary of the Communist Party. No one else well, at least were chairman of the KGB. Only Andropov was. And so during Andropov's rule, he started to make some few changes to the government. And so he made a new law stating that if any Soviet citizen does not go to work without any good reason, and they would get arrested for not showing up to work. So that was like kind of like a new law that he made under his rule. And so that was kind of like very crazy. And so people really had to go to work or they would be arrested. And that was a new law. That was a new law to all the citizens. And so he launched an anti-corruption campaign, which was to stop corruption in the U.S.S.R. that was going on that was going on in Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. And so they kept everything a secret from the people of the country because Soviet Union was basically like living in a cocoon. Like they didn't tell like the public that what was going on in the Afghanistan and how many troops were dying there. And so that was that like people didn't know about what was going on in Afghanistan. They just knew that all the people just knew was there was a situation in Afghanistan going on. That was basically it. But then Andropov's rule didn't last for a long time. He just ruled the country for almost 2 years, from 1982 to 1984, and so he died in the February of 1984, and then he would be succeeded by Chernenko. And so Chernenko time, nothing was going on in Afghanistan because it's been the same thing since Brezhnev and Andropov, and nothing was going on there. Like nothing big was changing in Afghanistan, and so that was kind of like the same thing that's been going on for almost um, 3 years now, from during that time in the Afghanistan war, the Soviet-Afghan war. And so in Chernenko time, it was really quiet because there was nothing going on during his rule because like uh, a lot of people were not being arrested because if they didn't show up because they didn't show up to work, they didn't get arrested. So that was one of the few laws that Chernenko created as he was the leader of U.S.S.R for almost 1 year, from 1984 to 1985. And so nothing much happened during his rule. It was just quiet, like nothing going on. Nothing was going on in the government. I mean, the corruption was still going on during his rule. And so after Chernenko died in March of 1985, March 11th, 1985, he was succeeded by the young Gorbachev, who solved and fixed the corruption in the USSR by making his new reforms, Perestroika and Glasnost. Perestroika is I'm trying to remember what it is. Acceleration, and then Glasnost means, I'm trying to remember. I can't recall how to pronounce it. So, I mean, into translated properly into English, I think it would be helping or something like that. I think that's from what I remember correctly. I can't translate it properly into English. So, and he was determined to fix all the corruption in the Soviet Union. But later on in 1989, the troops were took between 1988 and 1989. That was when troops were being taken out of Afghanistan, and that saved a lot of. U.S.S.R didn't have any money that was going on, and so because because there was not a lot of money left, and that's what led to the collapse of the USSR, and the people in Afghanistan and the Soviet troops in Afghanistan were dying because they were fighting against the Mujahideen resistance, which was being supported by the United States, China, and India. So at the time, and so Gorbachev he fixed the Soviet corruption, and that would and then years later, 1991, that was when he was arrested by this government, Russian government officials, and he was placed under house arrest, and he was under house arrest for some time. And then later on, he made a public announcement on radio that he's resigning as post as general sec or the president or the General Secretary of the U.S.S.R., and that brought an end to the Soviet Union in December 1991. And I'm planning to talk more about those details when I go into the future lectures. So thank you very much for watching. In our next lecture, I'm going to talk about the election of U.S. President Ronald Reagan, and then after that, I'm going to talk about the death of Brezhnev and the short rule of Yuri Andropov, which all took place in November 1982, and I'm going to talk about those two in our next future lectures. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next two lectures. До свидания. До свидания.